Magical realism. If anyone were to ask me to describe my country in just a few words, I would say magical realism. Magical realism portrays fantastical events in an otherwise realistic tone. And believe me, Mexico is full of these. The earthquakes that hit Mexico City on the exact same date every few years, the endless mystical tales that each individual city is filled with, the memes, the nuclear disaster of Ciudad Juárez, las mañaneras de AMLO, amongst other things. Mexico has some of the most magical, mystical, surreal tales of any country, and there's no doubt in my mind about that. One of those tales, and one that I've particularly been obsessing over the past few years, is the mythical tale of the Jacobo Zabludowski's Today Was a Sunny Day TV broadcast, or, in its original language, Hoy fue un día soleado. The historical context of the time is, sadly, forever tied to the TV transmission itself. I say sadly because the events that preceded it were to this day some of the most brutal acts of violence on behalf of a government to its people. Even in a country where the government is known as one of the most corrupt in the world, the events that took place that fateful evening of October 2nd, 1968 will mark a before and after that will leave a permanent stain on the government's reputation. To better understand these events, we need to go back to October 18, 1963. When it was first announced that Mexico would host the 1968 Olympic Games, an event that would put a lot of pressure on the shoulders of the next president in line from 1964 to 1970, Gustavo Díaz Ordaz. Gustavo Díaz Ordaz was heavily criticized for his strict economic policies while at the same time investing around $150 to $179 million in the setup for the Olympic Games, amongst other things. Ironically enough, it is speculated that Mexico was chosen as a host for these games since it was a cheaper option amongst other contendants such as Detroit and Buenos Aires, as well as Mexico holding an almost neutral state in the middle of the Cold War. The closer the time came to the games, the more presence the authorities would have around the streets of Mexico, as the president would actively attempt to suppress any issues that could intervene during the Olympics. One of the most noticeable acts of aggression on behalf of the government came during July 22, 1968, where a group of students from two different colleges, the Escuela Vocacional Número 2 and Escuela Vocacional Número 5, went to throw stones at the windows and students of the private high school Isaac Ochoa Torrena. The reason for these attacks has never been clear. Depending on where you look on the internet, the reasons vary widely. Most websites agree on these schools having conflicts for quite a while, however. Some speculate that this began due to a high schooler flirting with the girlfriend of one of the college students. Some say it was an initiation ritual that college students would often do for newer high school students. Some that the conflicts began at a soccer game. Some that rival gangs were enrolled at these schools. And some say that the college students were doing these things as a sign of protest against the PRI regimen, the political party that had and has been in charge of Mexico for a majority of its political history. One thing that made a huge difference for this particular conflict, however, was the proximity it had to the Olympic Games, which were taking place just 3 months later that same year. The following morning, the crowd control police, known as the Granaderos, broke into the Escuela Vocacional Número 5, took several students for incarceration while damaging the facilities and even hurting innocent students and staff in the process. It is speculated that each of the members of the Granaderos were offered 30 Mexican pesos or $1.75 per every student they beat up and arrested. 30 Mexican pesos back in 1968 will now be worth 350,761 pesos or around $20,000 per beat up student. It is also widely accepted as fact that many of these students were not only beaten up, but also murdered by the Granaderos, which were known for being especially brutal. Brutal acts of violence led to the creation of the Consejo Nacional de Huelga, a collective whose members came from as many as 70 different universities and high schools, all with the intention of peaceful protests against the then corrupt and brutal government of President Diaz and the PRI political party. These protests were all a peaceful attempt at promoting social, educational, and political reforms. This is also popularly known as the Mexican Student Movement of '68, or El Movimiento Estudiantil de 68. The movement started off by being frowned upon by the general population. However, due to their dedication and their unique form of organization and peaceful conduct, they soon began making noise amongst the general public. Soon, public bus drivers would allow these members to hop on their buses and talk to its users. Teachers would allow them to post their flyers on school boards and walls, and people on the streets would openly stop to listen to them and their message. As the movement kept growing in size and support, the Diaz government would also begin taking action against this group, most noticeably in the form of the Olympia Battalion, or Batallón Olimpia, a secret paramilitary group made up of members of the police, the military, and federal agents that was supposedly created for the sake of the security at the Olympic Games. This group would later play a huge role in the events to come, as they began infiltrating the student movement disguised as students and civilians. These members, as it was later discovered, were able to distinguish themselves since they used to wear either white gloves or a white scarf wrapped around their waist or wrist. The largest act of a peaceful protest, and one that would show the incredible leadership and resolution of the group, came during August 1st, 1968, when the president of the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, Barros Sierra, one of Mexico's largest and most pristine universities, openly led a group of 50,000 students in a protest that went for 16 kilometers in total. This protest had no turbulences, conflicts, or arrests associated with it. President Diaz, however, was not having it, and towards the middle of September, he ordered the Mexican army to take over the university, openly beating up and arresting students who showed support or involvement with the student movement. Due to these incredible acts of violence, Barros Sierra renounced his position as president of the university on September 23, 1968. Just the following day, the Mexican army was ordered to take over the Instituto Politécnico Nacional at Zacatenco and Santo Tomás. However, this time, students were not having it, and the army went with armed students ready to defend their beloved institution. On these events, Dr. Justo Igor de Leon writes, "Today, I've seen the bloodiest fights, unequal battles. Both sides are armed, but what a difference in weapons. 22 caliber pistols against M1 military rifles. Bazookas against Molotov cocktails." French newspaper L'Express reported that day-long battle left 15 deaths. The Mexican government reported 3 deaths and 45 injured. This is where we finally reach the events of the 2nd of October 1968, just 10 days prior to the commencement of the Olympic Games. The Consejo Nacional de Huelga summoned the students at the Plaza de las Tres Culturas at Tlatelolco. The purpose of this meeting was to recognize the efforts of the group, announcements, and planning for the following months. It is estimated that there were 10,000 attendees made up of students, teachers, parents, and other supporters. 5:55 p.m. 2 helicopters of the Mexican army began flying on top of the area that was being occupied by the student movement. Each fired a green flare to the sky. 6:10 p.m. One of the helicopters fires a green flare, while the other one fires a red flare. Soon right after, 5,000 soldiers, 200 tankettes, and trucks began surrounding the entire plaza. 6:15 p.m. The aftermath of the massacre is an event that is still debated to this day, although it must be said that the argument is always the Mexican government stating an incredibly low number of deaths against countless personal anecdotes, journalists, and students putting the numbers up in the hundreds or even thousands. The Mexican government reports 20 deaths. The number reported by journalists across the globe, including the US, London, and Mexico itself, lies between 200 to 300 fatalities. The estimations coming from direct witnesses of the event put the numbers between 200 all the way up to 1,500. Adding that, right after these events, there were cranes piling up and collecting hundreds of bodies that would soon be moved and incinerated. What began the shootings from the military to the students would remain a mystery for years, as each group would have a different recollection of the accounts, of course, but there would always seem to be a missing link. Military members would testify that the only reason they began shooting at the crowd was due to the students shooting at them first, while students and members would say that the military just began shooting with no real reason or initial provocation. Years later, it was revealed that the members of the Batallón Olimpia, same battalion unit that was created and directed by President Diaz, was instructed to infiltrate the meeting, as well as set up in surrounding buildings to the plaza with heavy weaponry, and open fire at students and military alike once the red flare went off. The massacre went on from 6:15 p.m. all the way until around 1 a.m. The event is now known as La Massacre de Tlatelolco. And 9 days later, the Olympic Games began. This is just a summarized version of the events that surrounded the massacre. There are so many important details, events, protests, and conflicts between the government and the students that I left out, but I did it for a reason. If my recollection of events has piqued your interest in the story, I urge you to watch or read the following media. Going back to the topic at hand, the mythical Zabludovsky TV transmission. One known fact in relation to the Tlatelolco massacre is the incredible lengths that President Diaz went in order to keep this as far away from Mexican media as possible. Word around the news station, journalists, newspapers, TV, and any other type of media at the time was, you talk about this, you lose your job. And that's just the beginning. At the time, Mexico's government heavily denied all allegations of their attempts to cover the whole thing, but it was clear by the disappearance of video footage, the lack of coverage of news immediately, and the chokehold most journalists were facing at the moment that something was going on. It is also important to note that the whole reason why this phrase holds so much weight is because of its implications. Jacobo has never denied stating this at the beginning of his broadcast, but he's never denied it because it was his most common greeting. The implication to the Mexican people and why everyone cares about this phrase being present in this broadcast in particular is because it would imply that, while being aware of one of the worst massacres in Mexico's history up until that point, Jacobo decided to start his news coverage as if it was just another day. Jacobo Zabludovsky was, at the time, one of the most prolific and popular Mexican journalists, with a career that extended over 60 years, reporting on some of the most important global events and being one of the only Mexican journalists that could get an interview with what seemed to be whoever he wanted. He reported on JFK and Robert Kennedy's murder, Winston Churchill's funeral, the landing on the moon, the Watergate scandal, the Olympic Games in Germany. He interviewed presidents, actors and actresses, political activists. Matter of fact, he was the only Mexican journalist that landed an interview with Salvador Dali at the time. For all intents and purposes, it seems as if something of the magnitude of the Tlatelolco massacre were to happen, someone with the journalistic integrity the size of Mr. Zabludovsky would cover it to the fullest extent no matter what. So then, what happened? He did in fact cover the events that took place during October 2nd during a TV transmission of Su Diario en Escafé, a news segment for which Jacobo was a host of at the time. Jacobo was in fact heavily criticized for his coverage on the matter, as he seemed incredibly impartial and disaffected about the whole ordeal, only reading what other media had covered and completely keeping his opinions and thoughts to himself. Matter of fact, a book by Celeste González Bustamante by the name Muy Buenas Noches, México, la Televisión y la Guerra Fría, reported that there was access to the scripts that Jacobo was holding that night, in which only 3 of the 7 pages were dedicated to the events that had just taken place. The scripts do not include the phrase "Hoy fue un día soleado." However, when asked directly about this, Jacobo would never deny it, probably because he used to say this so often that it would be ridiculous to assume that he did not, but by neither denying nor admitting to it, he could avoid an incredible amount of backlash for it. It would seem that one of the reasons why Jacobo would not talk in detail about this was the political affiliation his boss at the time, Emilio Azcárraga, president and founder of one of the most corrupt media corporations in Mexico, Televisa, had with the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, or PRI. The same relationship could also be the reason why there seems to be no record, video, or printed of said transmission, as Televisa is well known for involving themselves in these type of acts. One tale that Jacobo had openly talked about in relation to this broadcast a few years before his passing was his conversation with President Díaz Ordaz immediately after this transmission. Mexico's President Díaz Ordaz requested from Emilio Azcárraga to have Jacobo on the line right after his daily transmission was over. When Jacobo got on the line, he was immediately questioned by President Díaz Ordaz. "Why are you wearing a black tie?" alluding to the fact that maybe Jacobo was doing a form of silent protest because of what just happened. "Sir, I've worn a black tie every day for quite some time now," he answered. President Diaz stood quiet for a bit and then hung up. Hoy fue un día soleado is still relevant to this day because it would unequivocally reveal something that the Mexican people already know, but at the times we need reminders of, that the government and the media don't care for its people. Although no video proof of this transmission exists, I wouldn't be surprised if it will resurface in the years to come, as the lost media community keeps growing in popularity and numbers. If you were to ask me, considering the long history of corruption, of cover-ups, of media manipulation of Televisa, and the PRI itself, there's little to no doubt in my mind that this tape exists, and is still somewhere out there.